Hello, it's me, Gleb Alexandrov. This video is about using LUTs to color grade your 3D animations made in Blender or any other 3D software. LUTs, or lookup tables, are a popular color grading tool which can be really time efficient. It is very satisfying to browse through different looks in a matter of seconds. However, this tool is often misunderstood and used in a wrong way, and chances are you've been using this powerful instrument incorrectly. Let's start from the beginning. LUTs, or color lookup tables, are files that contain a set of instructions mapping one color space or color encoding to another. LUTs can be one-dimensional or actual 3D color cubes, literally remapping the colors in 3D, since color space models are three-dimensional, with axes for red, green and blue. So LUTs are just the text files basically, saved with the cube extension or something else like VLT. And indeed, the fact that it's just a file makes it really portable, allowing you to browse through different looks in seconds. This explains why it became so popular and a staple of color grading, really. The problem is that you can't just slap a random LUT on top of your Blender animation and expect it to look right. So if you have ever wondered why the colors look weird after applying a LUT, or if you've ever been unsure of how should it look, this video is for you. Let's drill down to basics and see how to avoid the common pitfalls associated with LUTs so you can unlock their true power. First of all, there are different kinds of LUTs. Let's talk about the technical LUTs first. First of all, in Resolve, all LUTs can be found in the LUT panel within the Color tab. Here you'll see various folders containing LUTs, and we can basically find them all here. If you want to see where all these files are located, you can right-click and open the folder with the LUTs. There you'll find all the files, and if you want to add a new one, then you can simply create a folder and place it there. In the VFX folder, you'll find a good example of the technical LUTs, or the LUTs performing some sort of conversion, like converting from linear to Arilog C or whatever. Essentially, this type of LUTs, and any LUTs for that matter, do the same thing as the color space transform node does. As in, every LUT expects two inputs, color space and gamma, and it produces two outputs. Just like that. Two inputs, two outputs. If for some reason one or two of these inputs are wrong, then we are out of luck getting the right outputs. Hopefully it's clear. In other words, if you apply the wrong LUT, messing up the operation or whatever, you'll get a wrong result, obviously. Sometimes though, even using the correct input and destination encodings won't cut it if you just want to apply a LUT and call it a day. As an example, let's take this OpenXR footage exported out of Blender. By the way, this is how it looks in Blender for the reference, with the AGX view transform in place, just so we know what to compare it with. Alright, so we know that the EXR export is always encoded as linear, and the output should be the sRGB display device, just like in Blender, with the color primaries being of the Rec 709 type, for completeness. So, if we now just implement the linear to sRGB LUT from Resolve, will it get the job done? What will happen in reality is that it kind of gets the job done, but the highlights get massacred along the way, totally clipped. Okay, that's something to understand about using LUTs for transforming an OpenXR footage exported from Blender. When working with a wide dynamic range data, slapping one LUT onto the footage just doesn't cut it. A so-called shaper or shaper LUT might be required first to compress that data to a manageable range for Resolve. One of these, for example. And only after that we can actually go ahead and apply the technical LUT we wanted to apply in the first place. The display transform LUT, for instance. That's how it works. Remember we mentioned 1D and 3D LUTs? A shaper LUT is often, but not always, one-dimensional. Just a one-dimensional curve, basically, that takes the values across all three RGB channels and curves it in some way. Not that it matters much, but I thought I would mention. Anyway, let's have a look at an example of how to use a shaper LUT in Resolve when working with an EXR footage from Blender. Here's one more high dynamic range EXR sequence from Blender. Obviously the preview looks wrong, as we have to transform it for display, so if we want to use LUTs, what we can do is Yeah, instead of using the straight conversion from linear to sRGB, we can use a shape LUT first, meaning the one that would convert it from linear to one of the logarithmic profiles, linear to RE log C, for example. That LUT would shape the HDR values to the logarithmic encoding, which is a necessary step in the technical LUTs chain, as we've mentioned. There is a bunch of such shape LUTs available in Resolve, as there are many different logarithmic color spaces we can convert our linear EXR footage to, like BMD film variations and whatnot. For the sake of this example, I'll use the linear to RE log C shape LUT. Okay, now all we need to do to finish it off is to add one more corrector node and apply the technical display transform that would convert the color space from RE log C, because that was the destination of the first LUT, to sRGB or whatever destination color space we want to use now. Any kind of display transform, really. We can find the display transforms for RE log color spaces in the RE folder, essentially this Alexa log C to Rec 709 file. Again, it's paramount to read the LUT file names very attentively indeed. Often that's the only instruction that we have as for what color space the LUT expects as its input and which color space does it convert it to. It's paramount to get it right. The name of this LUT file begins with Alexa log C, so presumably that's an input. And we must be on the right track because we used log C as an output of the previous conversion. The shaper LUT, I mean. Unfortunately, sometimes the names of the LUT files can be a bit of a trap, though, like a fine print in a legal agreement that seems to suggest one thing but ends up meaning something else. Okay, so we see log C and we think, okay, that must be the right one. It says Alexa log C to Rec 709, there should be no mistake, isn't it? It looks like it did the trick. We can even add one more correction node and swipe the exposure to see if the picture holds up, and it does. And yeah, if you don't know how it should look, you'd probably think it looks right. The problem with lookup tables, though, with the technical LUTs as well, is that unless the authors mentioned all the inputs specifically, we can never be sure. You see, the LUT that we used is called log C to Rec 709, where log C refers to the input gamma and Rec 709 to the output color space. Even in this official built-in LUT, we don't know the output gamma and the input color space. We got two unknowns. We can only assume that the output gamma is gamma 2.4, just trust me, and unfortunately it's hard to tell what the input color space should be. One could guess that it's white gamma 3, but we just don't know. And without that knowledge, the colors will most likely get skewed. How big of a problem is it? Here you can see it compared against the color space transform with the known inputs and outputs, and apparently there is a difference. How severe it is depends on the source material, but it is there. And that's the official LUT with no information whatsoever provided as for the input color space. Now imagine the ordeal with the random LUTs found on the internet. That's the main pitfall with LUTs in general, in my opinion, at least with how they are often provided. Ambiguity. By the way, you can hover over a little grid icon at the bottom of a corrector node to see what LUT does this node currently hold. So yeah, at the first glance, the log C LUTs that we used mention the same kind of log C thing, but apparently, as we've pointed out, the devil is in the details when it comes to LUTs. Like, implicitly, there are two inputs and two outputs in every LUT, and without knowing all of them for sure, we can never be sure about the result. Actually, that's why using color space transform effect often feels more reliable than using LUTs. Here I set up an alternative pair of nodes to show it really quickly. The color space transform or CST method for the same operations that we did with LUTs, I mean. Let me close the LUTs window for a moment and tweak the UI a little bit to give us a bit more space. Okay, and now I'll just open the effects bar and find that color space transform node, or rather effect, and drag it over these two nodes. So we should have two empty color space transform effects. Actually, let me connect it right away. So what I like about the color space transform effect is that you know all four parameters exactly. what the input color space and gamma it is, and what the output color space and gamma it is. There is no ambiguity at all that could manifest itself and spoil you the fun of color management. Like if you wanted to convert the linear Rec 709 of your EXRs to ARRI log, then there are two ARRI wide gamut options as for color spaces, and actually two logarithmic gammas for ARRI log C3 and ARRI log C4, not mentioning the rest of the options that the creators of the LUT could have used instead. That node should be doing now what the shaper LUT was doing, but with the known parameters. Then for the display transform effect, we can choose the exact same types. ARRI wide gamut 3, ARRI log C3. We can synchronize it perfectly, and then convert it to display Rec 709 and gamma 2.4, for instance. And we'll get the result that basically looks like this. But at least we can be sure about the path our color management took every turn. Comparing it to the result of the LUTs, it actually looks a bit different. As if the LUTs that we used assumed different versions of ARRI log or something like that. It basically doesn't line up. That's something to keep in mind. It's one of the reasons why some people prefer color space transform over LUTs, at least for the technical conversions. It is just less shady and ambiguous potentially. Okay, there's the other type of LUTs though, usually called creative. Creative LUTs are good for exploring different looks really quickly, akin to Instagram filters in some sense, and it can be pretty fun to play with them in Resolve. They often have cute little names like I forgot to take my socks off or erotic night in Casablanca or something. Anyway, some LUTs are just not the highest quality, especially with the authors not mentioning or even not caring about the precise inputs and outputs, making your video look like the Predator's Vision Modes showcase. And on top of that, there's yet another, arguably even more fundamental issue with using creative LUTs similarly to Instagram filters. But let's talk about some other things first before getting too negative. Okay, anyway, so you decided to download some creative LUTs from the internet, hoping for the best, that the input-output information will be available. How to install it? To install new LUTs, we can just right-click and open the file location, create a folder and paste the newly downloaded files in there, and then simply right-click and refresh, or go down this menu under the cog icon, then color management, and update lists here. To double down on it, it's paramount to check the LUT inputs and outputs when downloading or buying LUTs. Sometimes you can find this info within the LUT file itself. You just need to open it and have a look at the header. It can be opened with a notepad or something like that. Chances are the authors who created this LUT put the instructions inside as for the input gamma and the input color space, gamma 2.4 and Rec 709 in this case. That being said, it rarely goes like that. But maybe there could be some mention of these things on the product page or whatever. Then it becomes the trail of breadcrumbs to find our way back out of the witch's gingerbread house. So at least we know what inputs does this LUT expect, and so for instance we can use the color space transform node to give it these values. Gamma 2.4 and Rec 709 color space or primaries. So chances are these creative LUTs should at least work correctly. It doesn't mean it will look great though. It will look as intended, and that's the difference. For example, this Give Me a Coffee LUT will look as intended by its author, creating this Blade Runner-esque orangification of everything. Any creative LUT is also a transfer function when you think of it. So if you give it the wrong inputs, for instance, I will disable the color space transform here so you can see the effect, and the first one as well. So if you give it the wrong inputs, you will get the wrong result. Well, to be fair, sometimes if you aren't exactly sure what was the author's intent to begin with, it's hard to tell what is right and what is wrong, and that's why the technical specification that mentions the inputs is crucial. Okay, so often this type of creative LUTs are used kind of like a quick Instagram filter, a post-processing adjustment colorizing the image in a certain way, sometimes in a pretty peculiar way. To extend this analogy with Instagram, the strength of the look can be tweaked in the key settings via the key output gain. By bringing down the gain, you can manipulate the opacity of the effect of this filter. So technically you can add just a little bit of that if you wish. Or on the other hand, you can go full Instagram if that's what you want. And since you've already stepped onto this slippery slope, you might as well slide all the way down and use more than one creative LUT, which is often not the best idea. But technically it can work if we treat LUTs as these Instagram filters. Let's try something else. How about give me a coffee? I mean, this LUT. Again, the opacity can be adjusted to taste then, until it looks right to you. By the way, I'm not saying this is the way, treating the lookup table files as Instagram filters, yet it's how LUTs are being used sometimes, so I thought I would mention it. Before we go any further, let me just say that the promise of the instant fun that such LUTs kind of offer, it could be an empty sort of promise. It's usually a pretty bad idea to apply any sort of color grading after the display transform. And when you see something like Gamma 2.4 in the LUT specification as its input, it means that it's meant to be used after display transform. Or simply speaking, usually it means that it's supposed to be used with MP4 videos, PNG files and other final image formats which are just bad for any kind of color grading compared to intermediate formats like EXRs, as we've covered in other videos from this series. In short, there's not much that can be done with colors after they have been baked or locked in for display. So there's an inherent, innate problem with all creative LUTs that are meant to be used like that. It is just so easy to get the colors broken in multiple ways, although accidentally you may land a successful LUT, but the happy accidents won't compensate for the crushed shadows painted with one color and other kind of really weird issues. Like what? Like, for example, the weird color skews where saturated colors get a purple tinge of a really annoying shade or something like that. Or actually, how about that? The colors could get completely destroyed. I mean, clipped, oversaturated, the contrast ratio is broken, and just looking cheap in a bad sense. Again, as a rule of thumb, there's not much that can be done after the colors got baked for display. And that's unfortunately how many of the creative LUTs are supposed to be used. Either directly applied to MP4s and stuff, or used after converting the footage to the display gamma and color space. The final destination of the color space transform node usually. Which is the same as working with the MP4 or PNG files and other final formats. And I will die on that hill, I'm afraid. By the way, to reset or remove a LUT from corrector node, right-click and reset. Reset node grade, I mean. That's a bit metaphoric that we ended up doing that, I think. Alright. Is there a way to use LUTs for quick color grading without sticking to the silly post-display transform color space? There is such a way. There is a certain type of LUTs that combine both technical and creative properties, making them a hybrid, like a xenomorph infecting a predator led to a more powerful creature being born. Basically, this creature is the creative DRT, or creative display rendering transform LUTs. Such LUTs transform the data from a logarithmic to a display color space like the technical LUTs do, but then instead of keeping the colors fairly neutral, these type of LUTs contain a creative treatment. And that treatment can involve a super deep transformation of the colors, due to it being kind of wrapped around the technical part, if that makes sense. I will explain that bit in a moment. For now, let me just say that this hybrid is an incredible creature indeed. So it works like this. Well, actually, to make it slightly easier, we prepared a pack of such LUTs, and it is available at our Gumroad for free, or on creativeshrimp.com as well. You can buy us a coffee if you wish though, or a few cups of coffee even. Anyway, I have downloaded these LUTs already, and created a special folder for them, named Creative Shrimp, obviously. Anyway, these LUTs are called Arilog C4, Ari White Gamut 4 to Gamma 2.4 Rec 709, to be exact. Let me walk you through using them really quickly. So the crucial thing about these hybrid LUTs is that these LUTs expect a logarithmic encoding as an input. The Arilog C, Ari White Gamut, for instance, as a color space in this case. So given that we most likely will work with the EXR files, it will expect that we convert these EXR files into the logarithmic encoding. Actually, there is a technical LUT included for doing exactly that. It is called Linear Rec 709 to Arilog C4. You won't miss it, it's the first one in this bunch. All we need to do is apply it to a free correct node on top of our EXR footage. So it compresses the EXR range into a nice logarithmic format, or encoding rather. It's worth mentioning that the same operation of converting from linear Rec 709 to Arilog C can be done via the color space transform effect in DaVinci Resolve, obviously. And often it's better than using LUTs when you have choice, due to some minor details in the values distribution and so on, the stuff we won't go into right now. But as long as this tutorial is about LUTs, I want to show a LUT-only approach here, that's why I'm using this shape a LUT instead of the color space transform effect. Alright. And then the second operation will be creative, the second LUT. One of the creative LUTs from this pack. Some of them will be looking pretty neutral and basic, like this one, aptly called Almost Basic DRT, which looks kind of similar to AGX, Filmic and so on in terms of the colors, not doing anything particularly wild. With the left mouse button, click over this little number in the lower left corner, toggles the node on and off. So that's the Almost Basic DRT, or Display Rendering Transform. As I've said, it's similar to AGX. Speaking of which, there's also a base version of AGX included in this pack, and Filmic too, for that matter. It's always useful to have a baseline display transform available to compare everything else against. And obviously, what could be more basic than AGX and Filmic? The real fun stuff will begin when we take a look at the other LUTs though. The rest of the LUTs apply some kind of an artistic treatment while converting the colors for display, like this Kool-Aid LUT that cools down the colors quite predictably, or the Film Super Warm that would bring in some warmth and a filmic look at the same time. Then Super Dense imitates a very crushed film look, or with the inky shadows and that sort of stuff. So on and so forth, each LUT applying some kind of a creative transformation on top of the display rendering transform. And it works brilliantly with the EXR sources, needless to mention. Like, we can still change the exposure by plugging one more node before the LUTs in the processing chain and tweaking the RGB curves like that, pushing it left and right and up and down, depending on whether we want to increase or decrease the exposure. These LUTs should work perfectly under different exposure conditions, applying attenuation to the brighter values and doing some interesting stuff to safeguard the colors from clipping and oversaturating. You don't need to care about this, we just added a few parameters that prevent bad color stuff from happening, similarly to how AGX desaturates the extreme colors. Coffee. Oh, by the way, it's super quick to apply this set of nodes to any number of clips in Resolve by clicking Clips first to bring up the thumbnails. And then we can select any of them, any clip that we want to copy the current setup to. Let's see, for example, this one. And then we can hover over the clip we want to sample the setup from and click the middle mouse button. And that should copy all the LUTs, all the character nodes, and just everything from that clip. There's no need to take these LUTs too seriously. It's just a couple of creative looks after all. It's nothing that cannot be done with the regular color grading tools of Resolve, of course. That being said, all of these LUTs have been crafted with love. Alright, after this first bunch of filmic looks, there comes a slightly more stylized stuff, like this Blade Runner-esque orange haziness, or this pastel orange, playing with the selective color effect, or the second version of it, which leans even more towards that limited palette. I must tell you, it was so fun to make these LUTs, really. Again, middle mouse button copies the color grading setup if needed. And as a quick reminder, these LUTs generally work much better than the ones having the Gamma 2.2 and so on as an input, because the logarithmic color space is able to hold much more information about shadows, highlights, and everything. It just allows for more robust color grading styles. Okay, getting back to LUTs, there's of course a variation of a teal versus orange grade, a bit of a cliché. Then this Hell Dimension one is pretty interesting, the lovely red and peachy shades, which look a bit too reassuring for a hellish landscape, but anyway. It actually looks pretty awesome with these mushrooms. Then we have this Emerald one, giving it a ghostly greenish tint. And the Lavender Crush. You see, our naming effort is really showing with this one. Actually, you can just double-click any of these LUTs to apply it, instead of wasting precious time dragging it. Pretty cool. Again, AGX is included as a palette cleanser after all these spicy dishes, and the pack wouldn't be complete without the black and white LUTs. There is some sophistication involved in how these were produced, but it isn't that important, I guess. The inner workings, I mean. As I've said, we made sure it won't be clipping no matter what. And then there is also the bleach bypass, a classic effect. And then a couple more monochromatic presets, which I like very much. Silver halides, the regular one, and its nuclear version. All in all, it's a slightly different take on black and white, which is pretty cool, I think. As I've said, these LUTs can take some beating, even if you raise the gain or exposure to the extreme values. It shouldn't be clipping, and it shouldn't be oversaturating. Then this Color Sucker one is pretty fun. We talked about AGX, and please don't mind the nonsense. I mean, this nonsense LUT, it's just a more powerful palette cleanser to completely neutralize the taste currently on your taste buds. So you go swoosh, and then you can keep going with the other LUTs, which again can be activated by double clicking if that works better for you than clicking and dragging. As we've mentioned before, unlike the LUTs meant for the final image formats, this type of LUTs should be safe to use in terms of how far you can push the exposure, but not only exposure, the saturation and contrast too. In theory at least, it should be really hard to break it, to oversaturate or overexpose the content. By the way, if you want to mix a bunch of such LUTs, for instance this Blade Runner LUT with something else, you can do it by simply adding one more corrector node, and then the layer mixer, here it is, and then you need to hook two nodes to the respective inputs like that, and here goes the output. That second corrector node will be the holder of the LUTs number 2. I think that's pretty clear. And then you can just hook up another LUT from that pack, for example the Emerald one, why not? And then simply come over to the Key tab over here and adjust the gain, which is practically the same as adjusting the opacity or the strength of this second LUT. So this is how a bunch of LUTs can be mixed together, if that is something that you may enjoy. I don't use it that often personally, but still. Alrighty, that's it for the hybrid technical plus creative LUTs. Probably the most robust type of LUTs if you want to use any kind of LUTs at all. Which is not granted. Feel free to experiment with it and let us know how it goes. This Creative Shrimp LUT pack is available for download at our Gumroad page or at creativeshrimp.com. As a quick reminder. And remember, if at any point the info about the inputs needed for these LUTs to work correctly escapes you, then you can right-click any LUT to get to the file location like that, then double-click any file, and yeah, we've got you covered. We meticulously edited all these files to include this vital info at the header of the file. By the way, there are some pretty cool built-in LUTs available in Resolve right out of the box too. For instance, the Film Looks, a very well-respected DRTs in the filmmakers community, the Fujifilm and Kodak emulation. What I like about it, once again, is that the input information is in fact exposed in the header of the LUT files, and that's a rare thing to see in our times. The input gamma is a logarithmic one, the Cineon log too. So it's just a matter of setting up the color space transform like that to give it these settings, and you can give these LUTs a try. These are some nice film stock emulation. Finally, on our Gumroad you can also find the ProView Transforms LUT pack by Joe Genko. These LUTs have been baked from the Pixel Manager OCIO config, and it is a collection of the best free view transforms available to humankind, such as 2499 and its variations, AGX Kraken by Troy Sobotka and Filmic, Juan Pablo Zambrano's AGX for Resolve, and then OpenDRT and many more professional display rendering transforms that are free. Also including the eReachO's standard Blender AGX, of course. Big thanks to Joe for sharing these LUTs with us. By the way, Pixel Manager is an OCIO config for Blender and not only, which gives you instant access to all these view transforms right within Blender, so you can ultimately extend your color management capabilities. Pixel Manager. Alright, that was the basics of using LUTs or lookup tables in DaVinci Resolve for color grading EXR renders. We covered all the main types of LUTs that you may encounter and use: technical, creative, and this kind of hybrid, what we call the creative display rendering transform, and which arguably could be one of the most useful type of LUTs for us 3D artists. The only thing we haven't really touched upon is how to bake LUTs yourself in DaVinci Resolve, but that's a fairly involved topic if we want to do it right, so maybe we can do it at some other time. I hope you will have a lot of fun with the packs, the LUT packs we provide. You can snatch them at creativeshrimp.com or at our Gumroad, and I thank you for watching. That was me, Gleb Alexandrov, for creativeshrimp.com.